publicity. We're talking about a topic that shamefully gets very little publicity in Australia, and that is the existence of what people say is the largest single refugee camp in the world in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, a camp which is overwhelmingly is what's a makeshift home for Rohingya who have had to flee their homes in Myanmar, and a sense of the repression that the Rohingya have faced, and we're going to hear more from our speakers. In August 2017, the military in Myanmar, and Myanmar used to be called Burma, for those who remember it by that name, launched an attack which forced over 740,000 Rohingya out of the country and over the border into Bangladesh to Cox's Bazar. And that's not the first expulsion of Rohingya. In 2015, there were quite a number who tried to flee. They were trapped on a boat, and the then Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, was asked if he would help, and his answer was nope, nope, nope. And the truth is, actually, the Australian government since then, whether under the coalition or now under Labor, has really not been very much more collaborative than that. And yet the horrors go on. Just last month, at least 250 Rohingya and Bangladeshis drowned in the Andaman Sea. The Andaman Sea is the sea which from Bangladesh down the coast of Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia. At least 250 people drowned trying to make their way to Malaysia. And last year, probably 300 people drowned in similar circumstances. So life in the camp, as we're going to hear, is so bad that people are prepared to risk their lives on the high sea. We have two really excellent speakers joining us this evening. The first, and she will lead us off, is Professor Penny Green. Professor Penny Green is Professor at Queen Mary University in London. She's the Director of the International State Crime Initiative, an editor of the State Crime Journal. And she was in Cox's Bazar some months ago as part of her research. And obviously we're going to hear from her what she saw and why she saw it and what her thoughts are on that. And after that, we'll hear from Mohammed Zuhar, who is a Rohingya refugee who spent 9 years in Cox's Bazar and thankfully has now found safe haven in Brisbane. But he will share his experiences and about the oppression of the Rohingya with us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Penny Green to speak. Then we'll hear from Mohammed, and then after that, we'll have time for questions and contributions. So Penny, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to the Refugee Action Collective for organising this event. And hello, Mohammed. It's good to have you here. I'm going to talk fairly informally. I've visited the camps twice. My voice is far less authentic than Mohammed's, so it's more about the actual experience of life in the camps from him. But I first went to the camps, and we'll hear from Mohammed exactly when he went. I guess it was 2017, Mohammed. But I went camps at the time that that Rohingya were fleeing across the Naf River, across the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. Basically, because at the time I was analysing, documenting, trying to understand with my team the genocide that had taken place inside Myanmar. And my team and I, the International State Crime Initiative, had been working on the question of whether or not it was genocide from about 2012 onwards. And we certainly argued that it was. We also tried to influence the British government, who would have none of it. And so I had the experience of being inside the camps inside Myanmar. That was in 2013-14, and then in 2017 in Cox's Bazar. And then more recently, as David said, I was in the camps in December last year. So that's my experience of the camps. I think I have to say outright that the camps in Myanmar are the worst camps I have ever seen, and that they are forgotten people inside central Myanmar, just sort of languishing in these absolutely squalid, dangerous camps. About 140,000 people remain in those camps inside Myanmar. But we're here today to talk about Cox's Bazar, and I suppose when I first began this research and my first trip to the camps in Cox's Bazar was effectively to document and find out from the Rohingya survivors exactly what had been happening in the months leading up to the, if you like, the denouement of the genocide, the sort of the military operations that took place, but they were part of a process. And we should always remember that genocide isn't an event, it's not some spectacularized moment of violence. It's a process and it takes place over many years, often many decades. And that was certainly the case for the Rohingya. And I don't know if you agree, Mohammed, but I would say that genocide began from the 1970s. And it has, of course, its roots in British colonialism inside Burma. And so my first experience of the camps was really with people deeply, deeply traumatized, people who were still coming across the river, still coming to seek refuge in Bangladesh, escaping the appalling violence that was meted out by the Myanmar regime. And so the camps at that time were very in the process of being built effectively. Rohingya themselves were building their own shelters. They were given tarpaulins, I think, and certain vouchers with which they were able to buy bamboo huts so that they were building their own shelters. And many of the interviews I did took place inside those incredibly hot shelters, and there was always a fire going inside because that was the only way that the Rohingya women could cook. And the fire was made from wood. The Rohingya were forced effectively to chop down all the trees in the area in order to have fuel, because otherwise they couldn't cook, they couldn't survive. But that has led, of course, to major problems in relation to landslides, in relation to flooding, because the trees are no longer there to hold the ground intact. So that was the experience, deeply traumatized people trying to build a life. There was quite a lot of energy in the camp, actually, despite the unbelievable traumas that people had experienced. And they still had a temporary feel. There was still some hope that that they would be returning to Myanmar. However, here we are, many years on, and the Rohingya are still very much inside the camps in Cox's Bazar. The camp now, I mean, estimates are around 1.3 million Rohingya in those camps. There are 33 camps as part of the Kutupalong Balukali complex. And there was a camp initially that had been in existence many decades in Nyapara. The Nyapara camp had a sort of a permanent population. And I think it's also important to remember that when considering the community, that this was it's a very rural part of Bangladesh. It was sparsely populated, and all of a sudden now you have it's a city. It's a city. It's a bad city. It's a very complex city. It's a city that has brought with it many Westerners and NGOs, and a lot of external activity. And it's changed the dynamic and the demographic for the local Bangladeshis, who were very welcoming initially. And that atmosphere has changed a lot, I think, because the Bangladeshis in the region themselves are incredibly poor, and life is very tough for them as well. And so the welcome has worn off a little, and we might talk about that in discussion, and perhaps Mohammed has things to say about that. So in fact, what we were able to do was to document exactly what had happened in relation to the curfews, the build-up of the mass violence which took place in August 2017, by interviewing those people who had survived the genocide and fled with their families across the border. The reason I went back in at the end of last year was because I'm currently involved in a project looking at the humanitarian camp as a site of genocidal reproduction. And so this kind of flies in the face of conventional understandings of what a humanitarian camp is, because we understand humanitarian camps as places of refuge, safety, protection from the violence which is being fled from. My argument is, from observations in camps around the world, that actually the humanitarian camp almost hothouses genocide. So the idea is that if we understand genocide as a process which begins with practices of dehumanization and stigmatization and ends in erasure, that all of those processes effectively are being replicated inside the humanitarian camp. Now, there's no doubt that protection afforded for the Rohingya inside the camp to a significant extent. They don't wake up in fear of the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, in the way that they did when they lived in northern Rakhine State. But the conditions in the camp have changed, certainly since I was there, as the camp has become a more permanent fixture. And it feels more permanent than it did in 2017, certainly. And it feels that the infrastructure is developing. It's still very squalid. There are still open sewers. There are still toilets shared by 5 to 10 families. It's an extremely difficult place to live, and the Rohingya are still, if you like, prisoners. And I want to say very briefly, I just want to run through why I think the camp does reproduce these genocidal features and processes. And I want to do that because I think it's important to understand that camps are not a salvation, and that humanitarians there's a very ambivalent role that humanitarians play. And so I want to just very, very briefly, because I know I have very little time left. If we think about genocide as a process, as I mentioned, and that process beginning with the removal of identity, the dehumanization of the Rohingya people, which took place in a very vicious way inside Myanmar, and perhaps Mohammed will talk about that. But that dehumanization continues in the camps. So in Bangladesh, the Rohingya are not referred to as the Rohingya. They're referred to as forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. Actually, they just call them FDMNs. That is the way in which the Rohingya are described by anybody, any official and anyone in any capacity inside Bangladesh. So the identity continues to be denied. And the official stigmatization that goes with that dehumanization compounds that dehumanization. So Rohingya children in the camps are not allowed to be educated in Bangladesh. They're allowed some education in the camp, but they are only allowed 4 years of primary education. That's it. So there's no future for the children inside those camps. Dehumanization leads to sporadic violence. There's a lot of violence inside the camp. The people that we spoke to are extremely concerned and frightened, particularly of kidnappings. There have been a lot of kidnappings. There's trafficking within the camps, trafficking of people, trafficking of children, trafficking of women. these criminal gangs, often under the umbrella of ASA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which is not a political organization. It's basically a criminal gang. Ali Khan and other gangs are operating protection and extortion rackets inside the camps, and so there is a sense of real fear from within the camp. And there's also fear of the APBN, which is the armed Bangladeshi police, and those who manage the camp, and some of the host community outside of the camp, the host Bangladeshi community. Violence often leads to segregation, and that's what we've seen. The camp itself is a segregated environment. Apartheid operates within the camp. The parts of the camp are surrounded by barbed wire. Cannot leave the camp legally unless they seek particular permissions in relation to attend hospitals, for example, in Bangladesh. Basan Char, which is another, which is a makeshift island which just emerged about 20 years ago in the Andaman Sea, is now, if you like, a penal colony for Rohingya. About 35,000, I think, are confined to Basan Char. Along with segregation, you have systematic weakening, and the majority of Rohingya rely on rations. So there are some very vibrant markets that have emerged inside. The Rohingya are extremely dynamic in terms of the kind of communities that they build, and there is a dynamism certainly within the camps. But most people rely on rations, and the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, I'm sorry, reduced the calorific content that going into the camp, and so that makes life extremely hard. Healthcare is a real issue. Everybody we spoke to was concerned in some way about healthcare. And so these are just some of the processes involved prior to mass annihilation that are taking place and being fostered inside the camp. Now, I'm aware that I should really be winding up. And so I'm very happy to answer any questions. But one of the things that was striking in my most recent visit was asking people about repatriation and whether or not they wanted to return to Myanmar. Everybody wanted to return to Myanmar, but under very specific conditions. And those conditions are freedom from violence, citizenship, so that they have equal rights within the country, and an end to the genocide. So basically, Rohingya do not want to return to Myanmar, despite the fact that the Bangladesh government and the Myanmar government are in almost permanent talks about repatriation. The Rohingya will not return on those under the current conditions. It's far too dangerous for them. The genocide continues, and it continues on two fronts inside Rakhine State. It continues with the Myanmar military, and it continues also with the Arakan army, which itself is fighting the Myanmar military, but it is also focusing on in the racist way that the Arakan army is constructed against the Rohingya. So the Rohingya are now double victims, if you like, in this genocidal process. Is that my time up, Dave? I'm sorry.
Oh, but if you want to make a couple more points, that's fine, or else we'll go to Mohammed and we've got time for questions. So if there was something else specifically you wanted to add, please go for it.
No, I think I'll wait for questions, and I think Mohammed, I mean, people will want to hear much more from Mohammed than they will from me. So thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much, Penny. That was really useful. We'll now hear from Mohammed, who lived in the camp, but is now, I'm pleased to say, safe in Meganjin or Brisbane. So over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Professor Penny Green. Most of the valuable points you have already covered, so thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to RAC, the Refugee Action Collective, for inviting me to this important forum to share the real stories of myself and my community. My name is Mohammed Zuhar. Due to discrimination and humiliation from some non-Rohingya classmates, school staff, and university staff, I was compelled to use a Burmese name, Mamonting, during my education. I am a Rohingya from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, a country located in Southeast Asia. I was born and raised in Mondo Township in northern Rakhine State, Myanmar. The Rohingya community in Myanmar has faced decades of systematic genocide, discrimination, persecution, restrictions on movement, denial of citizenship, limited access to education and healthcare, and gross human rights violations. Before fleeing Myanmar, I lived with my parents and family in our village. Like many other ethnic communities, we simply wanted to live peacefully in our ancestral homeland with dignity and safety. My life changed completely in 25th August 2017 when widespread military-led violence erupted against the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. Villages were attacked. Thousands of innocent Rohingya people, including women and children, were killed. Thousands of I'm really sorry. I feel really emotional if I say these things. It's really heartbreaking for me.
Take your time. Take your time if you need time.
Yeah. Thousands of women and girls were subjected to sexual violence, mass rape. Children were burned alive, and civilians were pushed to flee. Countless families, including my own, were displaced. I witnessed extreme violence that no human being should ever experience, and my family and I were forced to escape for our life through forest, mountains, and dangerous terrain toward the Bangladesh border. Many people lost their lives during that journey, including while crossing Naf River in unsafe conditions. After several days of suffering and uncertainty, my family and I finally reached Bangladesh in search of safety. Following the 2017 genocidal campaign carried out by the Myanmar military and Rakhine extremists against innocent Rohingya civilians, more than 700,000 Rohingya people fled Myanmar within a couple of months. Today, over 1.3 million Rohingya refugees are living in miserable conditions in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, which is one of the largest refugee settlements in the world. Life in the camps has been extremely challenging. Refugees face overcrowding, limited access to formal education, healthcare challenges, restrictions on movement, and a lack of legal employment opportunities. Many young people grow up without hope for the future because of these limitations. Due to lack of legal employment opportunities, limited access to education, and ongoing hardships in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, many Rohingya refugees are forced to risk their life by undertaking dangerous sea journeys to countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand in search of safety, dignity, and a better future for their families. Tragically, many refugees, including women and children, lost their lives every year in the sea during these perilous journeys. These heartbreaking incidents reflect the desperation and hopelessness faced by many Rohingya refugees who continue to live without durable solutions or opportunities for a secure future. Despite these challenges, I remained committed to education and humanitarian work. I completed my Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Saito University, Myanmar. Before displacement, I worked as a teacher and humanitarian aid worker with Action Controller Fame, also known as ACF. After becoming a refugee, I worked with international humanitarian organizations in Bangladesh, including Medicines Sans Frontiers, also known as Doctors Without Borders, MSF. In addition, in 2021, I founded a community-based high school inside the refugee camp to support Rohingya children who are deprived of formal education. I worked there as a principal and teacher together with other dedicated teachers who continue trying their best to provide learning opportunities despite very limited resources and restrictions. These experiences have shown me both the suffering and the resilience of the Rohingya people. Even in extremely difficult conditions, we continue to believe in education, dignity, a dignified return to our homeland, and hope for a better future. Today, I am living in Brisbane with my wife and children, trying to rebuild our lives in safety and dignity, while many of my family members remain in the refugee camp in Bangladesh. I would also like to sincerely thank the government and people of Australia for giving us the opportunity to resettle here, allowing us to live safely and rebuild our lives with dignity and hope for our children's future. My family and I have a dream to contribute back to the country that we now call home, just as many Rohingya families who resettled earlier in Australia are already contributing meaningfully in areas such as healthcare, public services, defense, agriculture, and many other sectors. At the same time, I believe the international community, including Australia, can continue to play an important humanitarian and diplomatic role. First, there should be continued diplomatic and political pressure on the Myanmar military authorities to end ethnic cleansing, human rights violations, and ongoing persecution, and to ensure accountability for past and ongoing atrocities. Second, governments and international partners should continue to raise their voices in support of vulnerable minority communities in Myanmar, including Rohingya people, who continue to suffer from conflict, discrimination, and persecution. Third, the international community should work toward creating conditions for the safe, voluntary, and dignified and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees to their homeland in Myanmar. Any future return must be based on clear guarantees, including safety and security, freedom of movement, access to education and healthcare, protection of fundamental human rights, and the restoration of full citizenship rights. Until such conditions are met, humanitarian support for the Rohingya refugee in Cox's Bazar must continue, especially in the areas of education, healthcare, and protection of vulnerable families. Finally, I respectfully urge the international community, including Australia, to continue showing leadership in supporting refugees' resettlement pathways, providing resettlement opportunities for vulnerable Rohingya families, can save lives, protect dignity, and offer stability and hope to children who have grown up in displacement. Despite all the suffering, the Rohingya people continue to hope for peace, justice, and the opportunity to live safely in our homeland one day. Thank you very much for your time, attention, and solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for sharing your story. And I know it was obviously tough for you, but everybody here appreciates it. We'll now go to questions and discussion. What I'll do is I'll take maybe 3 questions at a time and then come back to Penny and Mohammed, and they can answer as they see fit. If you're in the room, then you can raise your hand and I'll see you. If you're online, it would be good if you could raise your little yellow electronic hand, so I can call you or put your name in the chat. So first off, we have Max here in the room in Melbourne.
Thank you, Professor. As you would know, crimes against humanity, genocide and so on can only be laid against individuals, but have any attempts been made to lodge with the International Criminal Court allegations, calling for investigations and charging the main individuals responsible for those crimes?
Okay, well, I'll ask Penny to come back when we've taken a few questions and comments. Thank you, Max. Mark in Sydney.
Hopefully I'm audible. Look, thank you very much to the 2 speakers and to Melbourne RAC for putting on this important topic on this important forum on this important topic, I should say. I guess I wanted to raise things about, Australia's annual humanitarian quota, which, as we saw in the federal budget, is stuck at 20,000 despite the best efforts of a variety of organisations, including the RACs and Amnesty and the Refugee Council. I did notice that Amnesty put in a submission for there to be a dedicated 1,000 Rohingya places, but that hasn't been taken up by the federal government. And from what I can tell, even though Myanmar, resettlement from Myanmar averages around 1,500 a year from Australia, it's mostly Karen, Kachin and the Chin, and the Rohingyas around 100 or even less a year. So I don't know if, Mohammed, you can elaborate on this at all, if you have any further information about what the Australian government's thinking, if there is any thinking about this? Because, it's now like almost a decade since the big genocide, 9 years anyway, that you mentioned. And I think the Rohingya have been a victim of the whole stop the boats policy, because that previously was the only way people could get out, and because they don't have the papers. And now essentially they're trapped, and, Australia's doing very little in terms of its official humanitarian program.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Got Kieran here in the room.
Yeah, I guess this is a question to the professor. As I understand, there was a change of government or elections in Bangladesh in the last 6 months or so. Has that led to any changes in policy? And I guess what, if anything, would help influence the government of Bangladesh to provide more support to Cox's Bazar? I mean, I guess obviously there is a desire to return to Myanmar, but until that can be done safely, the interim is to provide a safer environment for the people that are currently in Cox's Bazar. Has there been any changes in government policy after that election, and then what, if anything, can be done to influence that government to change their policies?
Okay, I'll go back to Penny and Mohammed if you want to speak. While you're just preparing your answers, I just should say I'm guessing that we have been joined online by a number of Rohingya, and I would just say that you are very welcome to put your hand up and tell us about your experience, either in Myanmar or in Cox's Bazar or in Australia if you happen to be here. But Penny, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. Max first, I think it was Max, you asked about legal action against individual perpetrators. So you have two international courts, the International Court of Justice, which is where disputes between states are dealt with. And so the Gambia took a case against Myanmar in 2019 to the International Court of Justice, arguing that Myanmar was committing genocide. Now, the decision from that, the determination that came out in 2019 was that Myanmar, and it's exactly the same as the decision that South Africa elicited from the ICJ in relation to Israel's genocide of the Palestinians, that Myanmar should continue to, or should, abide by the Genocide Convention and ensure that genocide wasn't being committed. So nothing happened to Myanmar, and they just engaged in full-scale denial. Then the International Criminal Court, which deals with individual cases, the International Criminal Court has issued a number of warrants against individual generals inside Myanmar, arrest warrants, should they leave the country and so on. One person who was missing from that list of individuals was Aung San Suu Kyi. So the idea that she is somehow exonerated from guilt is very problematic from my perspective. She led the government at the time. She knew exactly what the military were doing. She was a very willing partner, and she provided cover for the Myanmar military when they completed those brutal operations that Mohammed Zuhar just talked about. So there are individual arrest warrants out. I'd be delighted to see some of them arrested. I don't think it will make any real difference. I don't see that those kind of warrants make a very big difference in terms of justice. So it would be gratifying to see these perpetrators behind bars, but they are just individuals, and they're just. I think there are bigger ways to tackle genocide. The second question on the elections, has there been any real change in policy? No, not that I have observed. It's become an issue for Bangladesh and for political parties inside Bangladesh about what to do. They are committed, I think, ultimately to repatriation and are continuing to speak to the Myanmar junta about repatriation. In terms of what can be done to support the Bangladeshis. Bangladesh is a very poor country. And of course, and we know that aid budgets around the world have been drastically cut. I mean, that's obviously influenced the camps very significantly in Cox's Bazar. In 2017, you couldn't move for aid workers. There were field hospitals everywhere. And now they're just facades. I mean, the vast majority of international NGOs have gone. And so I don't see anything realistic happening in the future. I don't see that the international community doesn't care about the Rohingya. I mean, the contrast is very significant. I mean, and really sadly, the Rohingya haven't been able, because they're a much smaller population, for a whole range of geopolitical and historic reasons. When we compare them to the Palestinians, and I've worked on both these genocides, the solidarity movement is just so small by comparison, which is really tragic. And it's a forgotten genocide. It's a genocide that doesn't matter geopolitically to the rest of the world. Unlike Palestine is a different question in terms of the capacity to build a solidarity movement. And despite that, the genocide continues in both countries. So I'm really not sure. I don't have any sort of expectations of the current Bangladeshi government. I fear very much that forcible repatriation will take place, and we have a sort of a very difficult history of forced repatriation to Myanmar from Bangladesh historically, supported by the UNHCR, I have to say. So I'm not very optimistic at the moment, and I don't really see, unless there is a movement from within Myanmar which overthrows the junta, and then really tackles the whole question of the rights of ethnic minorities in the country. I mean, it's very interesting, the relationship between Israel and Myanmar, the two most racist countries that I have ever been in. But I think that until that kind of internal overthrow of the regime takes place, then nothing will change really for the Rohingya. That's the way I see it. And I don't think it's not important enough for countries like the US and Britain and the rest of Europe. So I don't think we're going to see much movement until something internal happens that changes the balance of power inside Myanmar.
Thank you. Mohammed, did you want to add anything at this point? You don't have to, but if you're welcome to.
Muted.
And you're muted.
Thank you. No, actually, I would like to say something about the question asked by Mark from Sydney, I think. Yeah. Actually, Australia has started providing resettlement opportunities like for some Rohingya refugees in recent years. And we are very grateful for that humanitarian support. At the same time, I also acknowledge that many other ethnic communities from Myanmar have suffered greatly due to conflict, violence, and displacement over many years. However, The Rohingya people remain among the most vulnerable and persecuted communities, facing a statelessness, denial of citizenship, as I mentioned earlier, and prolonged displacement for decades. Compared to the scale of suffering and the large number of Rohingya refugees living in difficult conditions for many years, the number of resettlement places remains very limited. Many vulnerable families are still waiting for the safety, stability, and future for their children. I sincerely hope Australia and the international community can continue expanding humanitarian support and resettlement opportunities for those most in need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I think we've got a question in the chat, which I will read out because people in the room won't necessarily be able to get it. But if in the meantime, if people have questions or comments, please raise your hand. Paul Dunn asks, is there an effective lobby group here in Australia advocating for a more substantial intake of Rohingya refugees? And Mohammed Adash, as a student in the Bangladesh refugee camp, I would like to tell you that we, the Rohingya refugee, especially the youths, are facing restriction to study higher education at the camp due to lack of opportunities to formal education, no income sources, and the children, the youths, are trying to escape to neighbouring countries illegally by boat. Thank you, Mohammed, for raising that point. Ian from the Refugee Action Collective in Sydney says, I only know of Amnesty and the Refugee Council that routinely advocates for increasing the overall intake as well as specifically for increasing the intake of Rohingya refugees. So thank you for those comments. Are there any more questions or comments? Ian in Sydney, Refugee Action Collective.
Yeah,
Coalition.
thanks, Dave.
Coalition.
Yeah, coalition. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, thanks, Penny, and yeah, Mohammed. Look, I had a couple of questions. I guess the point you brought up, Penny, about looking in Myanmar for substantial change. I mean, I agree with that. I think there's some promise because of the national unity government and the insurgency against the Myanmar junta at the moment. But I was particularly concerned. I'm not sure that I caught your comments correctly earlier about the Arakan army and that racism in the Arakan army are not specifically raising the question of Rohingya self-determination. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit about that. There certainly is my experience with the Myanmar networks in Australia is that in the national unity government there is a greater awareness of the discrimination against Rohingya and an awareness that a government that overthrows the junta should encourage that and recognise Rohingya self-determination. But it's always been a bit of a puzzle to me about there's a recognition at the top, if you like, which I'm not really sure extends to what's actually happening inside Myanmar itself and the extent to which the struggle itself is raising that question and that there's an awareness and perhaps the involvement of the Rohingya themselves in creating that that awareness. So if had any comments about that, and similarly, I didn't catch the last person's the student from Myanmar, but it's also one of the issues that's become Australia's unwillingness both to advocate for the Rohingya in terms of what's happening, the insurgency against Myanmar government at the moment. I think is particularly telling that it's not just there's no sanctions on Israel perpetrating perpetrators of genocide. We see precious little from the Australian government directed at the Myanmar junta. But so associated with that, we see boats, coming from Cox's Bazar, Myanmar to they get as close as they get us to Indonesia. But recently, there's been a greater degree of reluctance on the part of the Indonesian government to accept Myanmar refugees. I know in a couple of instances very recently when the boats have got to Indonesia, they've effectively been pushed back to sea or they've been dispersed. And I don't know whether either of you got any information about whether they are being dispersing themselves into Indonesia or whether they're having to make their way back to Malaysia. But I think it raises an associated point, and I'll finish with this, is that the Australian government, I think, has got a lot to answer for. I mean, it's right, there is a small number of Rohingya, get into Australia, but the Australian government has got a complete ban on accepting, refugees from Indonesia from, to 2014. And from my limited contact with Rohingya refugees in Indonesia, that they told me that they don't know of any that have actually been resettled out of Indonesia to Australia since 2012, I think they said. And that, I think, is a very, very telling point about, the Australian governments and the Labor government now shamefully perpetuating the Morrison government's, ban on everyone, all refugees in Indonesia. But it's got a particular, I think, concern about the Rohingya and its overall attitude to the genocide and the struggle in Myanmar at the moment.
Thanks, Ian. I've got Jasmine here in the room, and then I'll go back to our two speakers on the various questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much to Penny and Mohammed for speaking. I think it was a really, it's so interesting to hear about this. I have been active around, campaigning for refugee rights for quite a few years, and I don't know much about Myanmar, don't know much about Cox's Bazar. So I think that says a lot about, the kind of awareness there is out there, and the fact that it's really important we're having this kind of discussion and meeting and actually drawing the links to the fact that the campaign work we do day to day as well as RAC, like actually, the campaigns we're doing around permanent visas, stopping the temporary visa ban we ran, welcoming, letting refugees in from Indonesia, as Ian raised just before, I think is actually a really important way that we can have an impact on places like, on Cox's Bazar and those refugees, and actually demanding our message of RAC saying, refugees are welcome, and, permanent visas is actually really, really important to build on the ground, because actually we've seen in the past how the government does respond to pressure, like when we've had protests, when we've built, teachers walkouts for refugees and things like that. Those kind of pressures have had an impact and helped the government shift their policies and shift their position. So I think that just kind of brings it home that actually we really need to be making sure in the work that we're doing in RAC, we're linking that to, these kind of things like what's happening in Myanmar, like raising those issues in the work we're doing. A lot of us are involved in Palestine solidarity campaigns. We're involved in trying to build that pressure to get our government to cut ties. It's very much linked to, stopping refugees in Indonesia. It's very much linked. Refugees are a very convenient scapegoat when they're happy, when they want to cover for spending, millions in military, millions in making weapons that are getting shipped to a genocide. So yeah, I think like we have to make sure in that work as well, we're really linking that to the campaigning we're doing. We have to continue building this campaign to fight back against these racist policies that are really only seeking to divide and cause so much suffering for refugees, like in Cox's Bazar.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. So back to Penny and Mohammed, whatever your thoughts are on the points that have been raised. Penny, perhaps, do you want to go first and then we'll go to Mohammed?
Sure. I mean, on Ian's point in relation to the National Unity Government, yes, they've made noises about the failure of the NLD, for example, and many of them were involved in the NLD, to acknowledge the racism which existed against the Rohingya and other groups inside Myanmar. But they are just I mean, and they appointed a Rohingya as, I think, the head of, was it human rights inside the National Unity government for a while. So I'm not sure about the situation there. But I think you wanted to, so I mean, I haven't heard much about the NUG for a while. I mean, I think it's not incredibly active. I understand how difficult it is to work in exile. Um, the Arakan Army, I think I began doing work in Myanmar in 2012, and one of the things which was really apparent was the level of racism against Rohingya, even within the most liberal groups. So I was looking at different civil society organizations in 2012 that that were resisting the regime, had resisted the former regime, had worked in underground organizations, who had fought in the jungles, who had done everything they could to try and overthrow the regime. But they themselves were imbued with exactly the same kind of racism that emanated from the leadership, and they bought the line that the Rohingya were illegal Bengali immigrants, as they called them, and they weren't prepared at all. And it was a real shock to us that these were the most liberal activists by and large, and the leaderships were very themselves racist, particularly against Muslim groups within Myanmar. So that's the NUG. Then in relation to the Arakan Army comes out of the Rakhine, the largest ethnic group inside Rakhine State is the Rakhine themselves, the Rakhine. The Rakhine, about with 2/3 of the population. Obviously, a much larger proportion now that almost 1 million Rohingya have fled. The Arakan Army is fighting the regime at one level. Rohingya were initially caught in the crosshairs of that fighting and were victims of that fighting. But the Arakan Army is imbued with the same racism that the Rakhine were imbued with. And Mohammed talked about the Rakhine nationals, the ultra-nationalist Rakhine, who were involved in violence at least since 2012 against the Rohingya, and were involved in August 2017. So they themselves are deeply racist as an organization. And that is, of course, very presents another real danger for those Rohingya, especially in northern Rakhine State, who are sheltering in villages themselves, almost prisoners. And I'm sure Mohammed can talk more about that. But those who remain inside Myanmar, and I don't know, it's very difficult to get a figure, maybe 300,000 remaining in Myanmar, 300, 400,000. Mohammed, it's very difficult because, of course, they weren't included in the 2014 census. They haven't been included. There are no official counts of Rohingya because for the Myanmar regime, they don't exist. They are illegal Bengali immigrants. And so it's very difficult to get a sense of how many. But those that remain live very, very circumscribed and fearful lives.
Thank you, Penny. Mohammed, would you like to add anything to the conversation? Please go ahead.
No, David, Penny already mentioned most of the things. So yeah, actually, if I say about the Rohingya people who remain, who are stuck inside the Arakan state, right, Rakhine state, they are like it is not easy to express their challenges, in words. So they are in really horrible situation. Even we can't communicate with them because there is no internet connection, nothing. So yeah, every day, they are used. Most of the Rohingya people who are inside the Rakhine state now, they are used as a human child who in the Myanmar government, between the Myanmar government and the Arakan army have any war. So the Arakan army used as a front line human child to the Rohingya people and youth. So still ongoing rape, conscription, yeah, and so many other atrocities toward the Rohingya people. If I say honestly, the Arkan army, they are like worse than Myanmar military. Yeah, I can say, yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Now, we do have time for some more questions and comments. If anybody wants to, yes, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I know I'm Greta Bird. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
And I must admit I do know Penny. And I love to hear what she's thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about genocide recently, even in our own country, I must say, especially in the Northern Territory. But anyway, I'm just wondering, when Penny said like that human rights really couldn't cope with stopping genocide, well, with the Rohingya anyway, that there need to be an internal uprising. I'm wondering what can be done in the many other places, or if you're a person who can't be part of an internal uprising, how can you support that, or how can you do something perhaps in something that's happening closer to us? Because we often don't like to think, it's just, I have a daughter who's been working 5 years in Darwin, supporting First Nations people in particular, trying to bring about food security and things, but they have prisons there without any air conditioning that are just concrete hot boxes and all. And when you read about these things, you think, what are we actually doing as a nation? Sorry, so to bring it up, but there's so much that's happening here. I've been going out to the some of the pro-Palestinian marches and so on, but there's very little that we can do, isn't there? Yeah. Anyway, so maybe you've got some thoughts. And or do we just have to? I don't know. I've gotten to the stage, I'm this old now. I always was so optimistic, and now I think it's not getting better, is it? But there are little bits to think of Mohammed here and people like that we can take some people in as wonderful, but it's a country that's got to do Australia a bit of work on itself too.
Thank you for that. Happy to take another 2 or 3 comments or questions. I've got Matt here in the room.
Would just like to say again, thank you very much for Penny and to Mohammed. My question is around, Penny, you were saying that your research recently has been into the role of humanitarian camps in perpetuating and reducing genocide. And I was wondering if you could speak at all on the role of sort of our own refugee processes in Western nations, particularly Australia. I mean, we're really the world leader in things like, shamefully so, in things like mandatory detention, offshore detention, refoulement. And so I was wondering, if you could speak on the role that those sort of processes have in perpetuating and reducing genocide.
Okay, thanks for that. Any last thoughts online or in the room? No? Oh, yes, one last thought. There you go. Julius?
Maybe someone could explain why the historical reasons why the Rohingyas are suffering so badly from internal racism.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if there's no one else, those are 3 really useful points. I'll ask Penny and Mohammed to come back on those and also to make any final comments. While they're thinking about that, I just want to remind people who, if you're in Melbourne or Victoria, that we have a World Refugee Day rally on Saturday, June the 20th It's been put in the chat for those of you who are online. It's going to be at the State Library here in Melbourne at 2 p.m. And we're working on getting speakers, but so far we have Radi Bathlot, who is a Tamil refugee and has often spoken at our rallies, is a fantastic speaker. And we also have May Saif, who's a Palestinian community organizer, and we will have more speakers to announce over the next week or so. So Saturday, June the 20th, 2 o'clock at the State Library, if you're lucky enough to be in Melbourne. Okay. Penny, we'll go back to you and then we'll finish off with Mohammed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And hello, Greta. It's lovely to see you there. Yeah, I think a lot of us are feeling more despondency about humanity these days. But how can we support internal uprisings? That's difficult. I mean, I think that we have to work where we have the most immediate effect, and that's usually on our own governments and putting, enormous pressure, as much pressure as we can on our own governments. For example, in any trade agreement they have with Myanmar should be accompanied by human rights conditions and so on. In terms of supporting insurgency groups and internal uprisings, that is more difficult. But I think building solidarity campaigns in the way that you are all working towards is really very important, and it gives comfort to those who feel very isolated. I know that my friends in Palestine, whenever we have a huge march in London, to even receive photographs from the march gives them some support, that they feel less alone, and that's in itself very important, I think. And I think we have to continue with the solidarity work and really putting pressure on governments around the issues that we care about. Though I am also quite despondent these days, having once been much more optimistic. But I think that things can change very quickly, and so we need to create that kind of base so that we are ready to act when those conditions change. Matt, you asked the question about humanitarian camps and our own refugee policies. I think that across the world, we see that asylum seekers and refugees, migrants, as everybody, migrants are a problem for governments, and they're a very easy scapegoat for all of our governments. I mean, we're seeing that in Britain very, very sharply with government, the political parties trying to outdo themselves in terms of who can be more racist and who can be more unwelcoming to refugees. And of course, that creates exactly the kind of fear and animosity towards those who are fleeing violence and fleeing harsh economic circumstances that exist inside Myanmar. So, when we've got states that are encouraging ordinary working people to blame the difficult conditions under which they live, to blame refugees for those problems, to blame immigrants for those problems. The immigrants are taking jobs, the immigrants are taking houses. The immigrants are creating a hostile environment that doesn't make sense to those. It's very here, of course, we've got a horrible situation with the rise of fascism, led by Tommy Robinson at this point, and of course supported by reform, so-called. So I think that our own refugee policies are informed by exactly the same kind of racism that we've witnessed inside Myanmar and inside Palestine. And the only way to do that is to tackle racism on all its fronts and wherever it rears its ugly head, but to be quite systematic about it and to join up the dots. It's not just about individual groups that experience racism. It's a kind of, we have to recognize that it is something that we have to fight at every level. And of course, it does encourage precisely, it inures people to the kind of horrors that exist inside Myanmar and inside the Bangladesh camps that we heard about so movingly from Mohammed. And the final question that I was going to address was somebody in the audience asked the question about the historical reasons why the Rohingya in particular suffer. And it goes back to British colonialism, because when Britain was the colonial power inside Burma, as it was, and Burma it didn't have the borders that currently exist, and so there was the Raj. The days of the Raj meant that Britain would bring its trusted lower level civil servants, lower level workers from the Indian subcontinent to what was Burma, and privilege those people over and above local Burmese. So in Rakhine State, over and above the local Rakhine, the British saw the local Rakhine, the local Burmese as lazy and indigent, and they were they brought their own workers and privileged. And then when I say privileged their own workers, it's that kind of privilege of divide and rule. It's not a great privilege that they're being afforded, that the Rakhine were afforded. But nonetheless, that sowed the seeds of division, which re-emerge periodically and have re-emerged periodically inside Burma. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Penny. Yes, Mohammed, we'll give you the final word.
Thank you, Professor. Oh, actually, if I say there are many complex historical and political reasons behind the persecution of the Rohingya people. However, some major factors include discrimination based on ethnicity, religion, identity, and race. The Rohingya are a Muslim minority in a majority Buddhist country, and for decades, we have faced systematic discrimination, denial of citizenship, restrictions on basic rights, and exclusion from society. Many Rohingya families, including our parents, grandparents, were born and raised for generations in our ancestral homeland in Rakhine State, formerly Arakan State. However, despite our long historical presence there, the Rohingya community has often been treated as outsiders and denied equal right and recognition. Over time, hate speech, misinformation, nationalism, and extremist narratives contributed to hostility and violence against the Rohingya community. As a result, many Rohingya people became targets of persecution, forced displacement, and serious human rights violation. At the same time, I believe it is important to say that not all people in Myanmar support hatred or violence. There are also many individuals and communities who support peace, justice, and equal human rights for all ethnic and religious groups. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to both our speakers. That's one more round of applause. That wasn't loud enough. So thank you so much to both of you for giving your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, Penny. I think the weather over there is a little bit better than it is here at the moment. And thank you, Mohammed, because I know that you're speaking from hard experience and from your heart, and we really appreciate it. For anybody who missed some of the presentation tonight, we have recorded it. It will go up on YouTube in the next few days or so, and we will promote that link in our newsletter, on our website, and our social media. And please share, because while we've had people tonight who've listened and engaged, there are many, many more people who would benefit from hearing this discussion. If you are in Melbourne, a reminder that the Refugee Action Collective meets weekly, every Monday at 6:30, here in the Kathleen Syme Library, in the room where we're sitting, and also on Zoom, and we encourage everybody to take part and to get involved. And the final thing I'd say is, yes, we face some pretty bleak times, but there also is some hope as well. I think it is important to see that stopping a genocide is a very big act, and achieving that act is the work of many people, probably over many years, but along the way we take forward steps. And on the issue of Palestine, we have seen without a doubt the biggest global uprising for Palestine in our lifetimes. We've seen governments break links. We've seen workers in Europe take strike action in support of Palestine. We've seen rallies here which have included up to 300,000 people on the streets of Sydney. And we haven't won, the Palestinians haven't won, but as Penny said, when we stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, that raises their ability, their willingness to resist, their sumud, their steadfastness, as it sumud in Arabic. And amongst the refugees, I won't go through all the achievements, but there are something like 10,000 refugees in the process of getting permanent residency who previously have been rejected under the so-called fast-track system. And those refugees fought for their rights. They staged encampments for 100 days outside the offices of politicians. We in the refugee movement gave them their support, gave them the support they needed and deserved. And very quietly, Labor has backtracked and allowed those people permanent visas. And there are other wins, but that's a very significant one, and one that shows that actually the work we do does make a difference, and we need to keep on keeping on doing it. So thank you to everybody. Keep up the struggle. Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Mohammed, and I wish you a good night.